Well, innatism or nativism is the view that a substantial proportion of human knowledge is inborn, as we would say today, genetically determined, comes from within the organism, is not something acquired by sensory interaction with the environment or any other type of experience that the person might have. So the idea would be that certain kinds of knowledge, for example, knowledge of geometry is the classic example. You're born with that. It's not, you don't consciously think about it in the womb or as a child or anything, but it's implicitly in you, and all the environment does in the form of experience is elicit what's already inside you. So that doctrine, nativism, is opposed to empiricism, and empiricism is the view that all knowledge or most knowledge of any consequence is derived from the senses, through the senses, and in the classic phrase, the mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, there's nothing originally in there. Nativism is the view that the mind is a richly structured thing from the beginning. It's already got kinds of knowledge in it. And really the question has been, well, what kind of knowledge, how extensive, how much is acquired, how much of it is innate? The usual opposition is between nativism and empiricism, but usually it's a matter of how much is innate and how much is acquired. Not so much, you can't, even the empiricists can't say nothing is innate, because you have to have the ability to acquire knowledge at all, sometimes called general learning strategies. That's innate. Even for an empiricist, if the mind's a blank slate, then being a blank slate is innate. So it's just a question of how much is innate and what. That's really what the debate has been about. Plato has this. He had a theory and he had an example. The example that he gave was Socrates eliciting from a slave boy an understanding of Pythagoras' theorem. And Socrates maintained that the slave boy already knew Pythagoras' theorem innately. And so he didn't need to be told or instructed in that theorem. He already knew it. And by a process of interrogation, Socrates elicited from the slave boy an understanding of Pythagoras' theorem. So Plato concluded from that famous example, it's in the Meno, that the knowledge of geometry, at least, was inborn. And then Plato had a theory about that. Knowledge of geometry involved what he called universals or forms, so we have innate knowledge of forms. Plato also believed in the form of the good and many other forms, all general concepts basically. And his theory was, how did this knowledge of general concepts or properties get into the mind? Because we had a prenatal existence during which we were in much more direct acquaintance with the world of forms. And then when our soul was in that form, and so our soul then contained knowledge of the forms from this prenatal existence. When we became embodied into the empirical world, we lost our memory of all of this that we knew before. And then learning, so-called learning, is really just recovering the memories that you had from your pre-existent life. So it's called anamnesis. So it was the reversal of amnesia. That was his theory of how knowledge of this kind was developed. Now Plato, of course, didn't believe that knowledge of history or geography in that way. It was knowledge of more abstract general propositions. So Plato thought that there must have been a pre-existing state of the soul in which the soul somehow directly perceived these things and knew with perfect clarity the nature of these geometrical or moral or whatever entities. Not just those, it could be colours as well, because colours and shapes are also universals. So, and then there was this strange process whereby people forgot. It was erased, not erased completely, but like you just forgot. And then you spent your life recovering those memories. And that's what Plato's view about what so-called learning is. Apart from things like knowledge of history and geography, where obviously you need to use the senses to find out things like that. Plato raised the issue, but it was really not until the time of Descartes, 17th century, that the issue was resuscitated, and then Descartes made decisive contributions to that debate, reviving Plato but also developing Plato. Descartes held a very strong view of innatism, actually, and I think people have not always appreciated just how strong it was, and in my opinion it is the correct view, despite it being very strong. So Descartes thought that virtually all ideas are innate. A great deal of knowledge of propositions is innate, particularly the propositions of metaphysics and mathematics he thought were innate. He didn't talk much about morality, but he probably would have think that too, anything which philosophers would call a priori. But he also thought that what are called ideas of sensible qualities, like the idea of red, or the idea of a circle, or the idea of a triangle, or the idea of warmth, and so on. He thought those were innate too. We do not acquire those through the senses. So in his opinion, when we all have the idea of what a red thing is, that's something we're born knowing what a red thing is. We don't acquire that by perceiving red things. Whereas the empiricists, particularly in the form of Locke thought, especially for ideas of sensible qualities, that we clearly get those, he thought, from perception. We had no idea of red when we're born of any kind. Then we see a red object, and then he thought we abstract the idea of red. From that, we abstract the quality and generalize it, and that's how we get the idea of red. But Descartes' view was that we're born knowing what red is. It's an innate idea. Not that a person's consciously having that images of red when they're in the womb or all the time. Part of Descartes' position was that these ideas are unconscious, and they're made conscious by various processes like directing attention or sensory stimulation will make them conscious, but they exist unconsciously in the mind from the very beginning. So if we put it into modern terms, and in its strongest form, according to Descartes, the idea of redness is encoded in the DNA. Already it's implicit in the DNA we have, and at the earliest stage of conception there's an organism which in its brain it has the idea of red. And when a person comes to see a red thing, what happens is that an external stimulus elicits an internal innate impression. So the organs of the body are innate, they're genetically determined. Nobody thinks you get to have the anatomy that you have by interacting with the environment. But the environment plays a role. Of course, you need nutrients for the body to develop at all. Food has to come in, so the environment plays a role. But the environment doesn't form the organism as an anatomical unit at all. It just elicits that form. So it's in the DNA, and with maturation and nutrition from outside, that program unfolds, and there the body of an animal then develops. You don't learn to have the body that you have. By exact analogy, you're born in your DNA having a certain psychological anatomy, these concepts, this knowledge, these ideas, and through the process of maturation, the brain develops through the same mechanisms, and these mental organs develop, and they involve thought, cognition, and they grow mental organs just like the body grows its physical organs, and those are your ideas that you're born with. And the environment just plays a role of triggering and providing the nutrients to enable the thing to work. But when it comes to determining the form of the mind is not determined in any way by the environment. It's determined completely by the genes. I suspect myself that unconsciously people were attracted to empiricism despite its obvious problems, because at least it told them something where they could begin to tell themselves they understood how you might get knowledge, how you might get ideas of Platonic universals, basically. The trouble is it just collapses when you look at it. But then then you accept nativism. Well, it would be great if nativism had a story, but it doesn't. Now, what's very fascinating is Descartes had a story. Descartes understood this perfectly well, I think. His story was I would paraphrase like this: we've got innate ideas. They are just as Plato said they are, and that is a very remarkable thing that we have those ideas. So how can we explain it? We need a very remarkable explanation for it: God. I think Descartes was a fervent theist. I think you just read the Meditations. He's not pretending to be a theist. One of the main things he argues in the Meditations is that the idea of God is innate. He's very anxious to argue that the idea of God is innate. So we do not acquire the idea of God from anything in experience. We already know what God is in the womb. We know that. And he had a view about what the idea of God involves, which was pretty traditional. It involves the idea of infinity and power and perfection, those kind of things. So we thought we had the ideas of infinity and the ideas of perfection innately. Put those together, we get the idea of God. You have to put in the moral side, but Descartes again was not very interested in morality. But so he thought the idea of God was innate, and then he used that as an argument for the existence of God, because he said, well, if the idea of God is innate, it had to be caused by something. Then he had a principle that has to be as much reality in the cause as there is in the effect. And then he argued that because of that, God had to be the cause of our having the innate idea of God, therefore God exists. And that's how he argued, since God exists, God wouldn't allow us to be deceived, and that's how he answered the skeptic about the external world. It's a little bit like Plato. He thought that God implants in us not just the idea of God himself, but implants all the other ideas in us. That's where they come from. They don't come from the environment through sensation. They come from God directly implanting those ideas in our minds at birth. So I think he was right to say that all ideas are innate, but not because God implants them there, because they're put there by natural selection and forces of evolution. So they're encoded in our DNA, and they're inherited. We inherit our ideas from our parents' DNA, and they're inherited directly from previous generations. So I would say myself that most human ideas are inherited from the ideas of fish, which are transmitted down through many, many countless generations over millions of years. So the reason I have ideas of colour now is because there were sea-dwelling creatures millions of years ago who evolved those ideas themselves, and they were innate in them, and they gave them to their ancestors. And then through the long sequence of evolution, eventually mammals, and eventually primates, and eventually us, basically they're just transmitted genetically down through hundreds of thousands of generations, and they're hereditary. So Descartes, of course, couldn't think this because Descartes operated in a pre-Darwinian age, so he didn't have this even as an imaginative possibility. It was just God. So you just get rid of God from Descartes' picture and replace it with Darwinian evolution, and that's, I think, the right description of what's going on. So Chomsky, yes, beginning in the, I guess, the late 50s, but certainly in the 60s, turned the field on its head completely, because he attacked the empiricist assumptions and dogmas of that time, which at that time were expressed in the form of behaviorism and the behaviorist theory of learning, which was mainly, at that time it was B.F. Skinner, although earlier behaviorists, most people know J.B. Watson was, but many people don't know Clark Hull was. Clark Hull was an American psychologist who probably had the most explicit formulation of behaviorism rather than just slogans, but he had a more precise theory, and one of Chomsky's points was that when you make the theory precise, it collapses. Chomsky, battled with people then, but essentially won that battle. And then so everybody became convinced that behaviorism was wrong, and then it became less and less popular. And then cognitive science was formed, and Chomsky really was the person who, more than anybody else, was responsible for that. He cast it in a more computational framework, which again was not available to somebody like Descartes. So you get sort of computational innatism came out of Chomsky, because he was mainly interested in language. But Chomsky would talk about other areas of knowledge, though he focused on language. There's been recent work on knowledge of morality, and there's quite a lot of interest among psychologists in the idea that morality is innate, which I think, and argued that myself in a book of mine. But Chomsky hadn't really discussed all of Descartes' claims, specifically the issue about the innateness of ideas of sensible qualities like shape and colour. Yeah, well, Chomsky just says different things about semantics. Sometimes he sounds as if he's only wanting to talk about syntax, but on my reading of him, he also thinks that what he calls the semantic component is innate, because he thinks the conceptual structure or the conceptual system behind language is innate. And that's certainly my view. My view is that when you look at the language module, as Chomsky would say, it consists of different components. As Chomsky says, there's a phonological one, there's a syntactic one, and there's a semantic one. I think of the semantic one as essentially on the level of thought, or concepts or ideas, and I think all that's innate. Then I think we have an additional syntactic component separate from that, which is also innate. And other animals that have thought do not have that separate syntactic component. That's why they don't have language. They've got thought like us, but they don't have language like us. And then there's a phonological component too. So I think that Chomsky, though he doesn't talk about this very much, basically thinks that the semantic component is innate, the basic conceptual system. And sometimes he'll mention Descartes on geometry and express sympathy with that. But most of Chomsky's writings are not about that. So the way I see it is that language is one example, and I don't really think myself it's all that representative or characteristic of the mind. I think language is certainly a human faculty which other animals don't have, but I don't think that, I wouldn't want to say that human nature is defined by the linguistic nature of humans. I think human nature is much more a composite of an inherited nature from our ancestors going back to many other species. That's part of human nature. Part of our nature is fish nature, or reptiles, and and earlier apes and so forth. That's all inherited. And then at some more recent point, we added onto that an innate syntactic component, which gave us language in the sense that we have it. And according to my general views, language was initially a gestural language. There was no phonological component until that was added later on, even later. And then we started speaking using our mouths, and then a phonological component came in. So the way I look at human nature is I don't look at it as something which exists separately from the nature of other species. I think of it as connected to other species. And I don't really myself think that language is essential to thought at all in humans or in other animals. I think the way we think is far more important about us than the fact that we talk. So what strikes me mostly about the human mind is the same thing that struck Plato and Descartes. It's our ability to think, and Leibniz, to think about necessary truths. Now let me add one, what I call a sting in the tail to this, because though I think all this it's correct, so I think that yes, all these ideas are innate, you might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable about it, because you might be wondering, okay, I'm convinced that these ideas are all innate, but I don't really understand how they can be there. I don't really understand their being there at all. When you're an empiricist, you have a story to tell about how they get there. Right? Well, there's an object out there. It's got the colour, it's got the shape. You open your eyes transmit this quality into your mind, and then you get the idea of the quality. But if they're innate and they don't come that way, how do they get in there? How do they get there? So to put it in a very sharp form, how do strands of DNA contain ideas of Platonic universals? It's impossible to understand. So my view is that although nativism is true about these cases, it's a complete mystery. So my view is very similar to my view of consciousness. I think that we have consciousness, it does arise from the brain, but it's deeply mysterious how it can arise from the brain. So I think we have innate ideas, they have all the characteristics which Plato and Descartes said in the fullest form, the universality and the intentionality, and not as if or anything like that. But how they managed to develop inside a physical organism from strands of DNA is a total mystery. Some people might think this is outrageous because they believe it's not scientific. They think that in the sciences, all mysteries have been removed, and to claim that there are mysteries is to say that something is outside the realm of the scientific. That's an exceptionally naive view about science, which really doesn't stand up to a moment's scrutiny of the history of science. So anybody who knows anything about the history of physics knows that when the mechanical philosophy that Descartes was trying to develop collapsed with Newton's introduction of gravity, at that moment, as Chomsky said many times, and Newton said it's an occult quality which he has no explanation of, at that moment physics became enmeshed in mystery, because there was a force which could not be accommodated within common sense physics, which was what mechanism in Descartes' hands was. So, and as physics developed, the mysteries only grew. Not that mystery wasn't resolved. The whole problem, when electromagnetism was eventually discovered and investigated, nobody really knows what electromagnetism is. In my view, actually, nobody knows what electricity is. We think we have the word, we talk about it. We don't know what electricity is. It's just something we name. And it's a force out there and it's different from gravity. None of this fits into the old mechanical philosophy. It's all mysterious. I don't think we know what matter is. I don't think we know what space is. I don't think we know what time is. We have descriptions of them, usually mathematical, and we have some sort of common sense notions that we bring to bear. But if you ask, do we have knowledge of the intrinsic character, of the objective nature of space, time, matter, electricity, gravity, we don't. And this is a view, if you read philosophers of physics from Russell onwards, including Poincaré, including a great many Eddington, this is an orthodox view in philosophy of physics, to anybody who knows about physics. Philosophers don't know this because they just have a very toy person's view of science. They don't know any science and they don't know the history of science. They just have a sort of village materialist idea of what science is really all about. And so they think science is somehow, there are no mysteries in science. It's completely wrong to think that. So actually, it's completely consistent with our entire worldview to suppose that there are mysteries dotted across the intellectual landscape at different points. This can be a quite liberating insight because it prevents you rejecting ideas as false simply because you don't really find you can't really understand them. So if somebody were to come along and say, well, you say you're a nativist about all these ideas, but I don't understand how that can be so, therefore nativism is false, my response is that's a complete non sequitur. You can't infer that it's false from the fact you don't understand it. There are many things we don't understand. Quantum theory doesn't mean it's false. We don't understand gravity, doesn't mean it's false. We don't understand innate ideas, doesn't mean it's false, same consciousness. These are all things we can know to be true, and we can rationally establish theories involving these notions, but does that mean that we can achieve a kind of understanding of them at all comparable to mechanism as Descartes understood it in the 17th century? Well, no, we can't, and that's just tough. But this is my philosophical outlook, which to me is not a token of despair, it's just an ability to recognize truth when it's there and not reject it just because it doesn't fit into the very restricted human viewpoint on the world, which nobody should expect that reality objectively should fit into the human viewpoint on the world. So this theoretical issue bears very directly on questions of education. There has to be a suitable, a hospitable environment for the innate program to work. So just as with the body, if you don't have a healthy environment, the body will not develop properly, physiologically. The mind is the same. But we shouldn't exaggerate it to go to the level of the empiricists who think that everything is just fed into the mind. You have to think of the job of the educator as trying to bring out what's already in there. So this will involve a de-emphasis of memorization. And a lot of educational policy has been tacitly empiricist. And according to that view, Locke's view, it's all memory from the environment. There's nothing in there. It's all just memory. So you get kids to memorize things. Complete misconception about what education is if you follow Plato and Descartes. What most education is, especially in mathematics, but not just in that, is the child already knows. You just need to present them with the right questions or the right stimuli for it to come out. You don't have to bombard them, you see, and sort of drill it into them. That's the mistake. But if there's nothing eliciting it, then the atrophy might be the result. But what you want is a sort of a sympathetic questioner who knows how to bring out what's already in there. So in a way, we don't need to emphasize the environment quite as much as empiricists thought. But a nativist would certainly agree that you want a good environment. The question really is, what's the best way to design an environment to exploit the knowledge that the child already has, realizing that you're not just feeding the knowledge into an empty container through memory. So some people think this nativism has a bearing on individual differences between people because they're very obsessed with whether one person is more intelligent than another person. Everything I've said is completely independent of that. Nothing I've said implies any particular view about individual differences. If anything, it's the opposite, because what I'm talking about is a common human nature. Every human being, as Chomsky's always emphasized, has the ability to speak. Everybody has all these innate ideas of geometry, and we're all completely at an equal level as far as this is concerned. Individual differences may arise partly from genetics, they may arise from the environment. That's a completely separate matter. I think what's important to see from a more political, ethical point of view is that there is such a thing as human nature and everybody shares it. And so if you go to a tribe in remotest Africa, as people used to do, you will find that they've got the same innate mind that you've got, and their language is the same complexity as yours. Why? Because it's innate and it's just written into everybody's nervous system. Why? Because we all evolved from the same ancestral stock, and so there's a commonality there. So I don't see at all this view of nativism as in any way dividing people or justifying discrimination between different people. If anything, I think it makes you see all human beings as belonging to the same biological family.